Hi friends! Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best works of the social left and debate the policy positions of the movement we create together. Thanks for being patient the past couple of weeks, waiting for this video, while I was dealing with filing my taxes, moving into a new apartment, and getting promoted at work. Last time we spoke, I was covering the compromise position to what I originally proposed to you all as the Worlds of Service program, which would be an extension to the existing YPP UN program. As well, we discussed the elevation of political discourse from questions asked at rallies to blunt progressives running for the presidency like Mike Gravel. I highly encourage you all to check out that episode if you haven't seen it already, and that you check out Mike Gravel's new policy platform. It truly is an amazing read, and I've included it all for you in the description section below. In addition to last week's episode, we've also kicked off some fun initiatives over on the old Twitter with our launch of our take on March Madness for all the podcasters out there called Pod Madness. And by launching also a weekly tiering process for all of the 2020 candidates, not just Democrats, with our Terrific Tuesday initiative. Currently, we are in the Sweet 16 of Pod Madness after a couple intense rounds of thousands of you voting to decide whose pod reigns supreme. Our remaining participants include the following podcasts: Secular Talk, Citations Needed, Intercepted, The Antifada, Deconstructed, Chapo Trap House, Emma Vigeland, Street Fight, The Breakdown, Current Affairs, The Katie Halper Show, Age of Napoleon, Democracy Now!, The Majority Report, Revolutionary Left Radio, and The Rational National. If you're a big fan of any of those channels, make sure you voted in the Sweet 16 over on our Twitter page. The Elite 8 will be released on Wednesday night. Also, make sure when you finish voting there and watching this video that you also go to our Terrific Tuesday poll that I've included in the description section below so that you can give your grades to all of the candidates. After 49 of you voted last week, my goal for this upcoming week for Terrific Tuesday is that we can reach 100 participants. So I'll hope that you'll vote and help us get there. We've included it in the description section so you can do that. Finally, before we jump into this week's episode on our Brexit poll and the right to freedom of movement, I want to give you all a reminder to be on the lookout for next week's poll that will come out with the release of this video over on Twitter. So, as I just alluded, this past week's poll was on the subject of Brexit and the broader question of whether or not the UK should stay in or leave the EU. With 91 voters, you all decided that the proper decision was to stay in the EU, with 76% of you deciding that. This figure, when compared to polling from sources in the UK, is fairly higher, as only 41% say we should remain, 35% believe they should leave, and 24% still don't know what should be done. I believe the reason we had much higher results is many who identify as socialist or left-leaning usually tend to favor multilateral agreements that allow individuals greater rights and centralized functional capabilities. Before I give you my opinion on what should be done today, and what I hope the final solution should be, I should note that I'm recording today, on 4/12, on what was once a deadline for the decision that was punted to October 31st to decide. I think before I give my decision on if staying or leaving is more beneficial, I should also give a slight rundown on how and why the UK got themselves mixed up in this Brexit mess, what factors are being weighed when considering all of the past proposed solutions, which of those factors are the most important, and finally, what the final solution should be. So, in 1957, France, West Germany, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands signed the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community, the predecessor to the EU of today. The purpose was to foster economic coordination among European nations. After the fallout of World War II, they figured that trading would make it less likely for them to go to war with one another. Makes sense to me. The UK applied to then become a part of the EEC in 1963, but due to some French interference over worries of the official language going from French to English by them becoming members of the EEC, the UK was not admitted until 1973. This wasn't the first time either a referendum like Brexit occurred. Only 2 years later, in 1975, a referendum was held on whether they should stay in the EEC, and the UK at the time decided to do with 67% of the vote to stay. This is much closer to what our community polling has shown. The only parts of the country at the time that majorly disagreed with this referendum were Shetland and the West Isles. Interestingly enough, Shetland, this time around, voted to stay in the EU when it came to Brexit. At the time, too, just like today, as we've seen with the splintering of the Labour Party from the center-left into the independent group, so too at the time of the EEC was there a similar fracture in Labour, forming the known Social Democratic Party, or the SDP. I should mention that although they share a name with a part of the tenets of my political beliefs, I tend to side more with the Labour Party on an issue-by-issue basis. Sometimes labels are helpful, and other times they can simply become a weapon of obfuscation. So back to Brexit. In 1984, tensions were rising when another Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was talking tough to the EEC to reduce British payments. Among nations at the time, they were the third poorest. But due to a lack of agricultural industry in the UK, they didn't qualify for as many subsidies that made up 70% of the EEC's expenditures. Thatcher's negotiations resulted in an 8% drop in the EEC budget coming from the UK sources from then in the 80s to now today. Then, in 1993, the Maastricht Treaty took effect, creating the Brussels-based EU as it is known today. The EU was created to integrate the countries of Europe politically and economically with a united foreign policy, common citizenship rights, and, for most member nations, not including the UK, a single currency, the euro. Then, in 1997, when Tony Blair, a staunchly pro-EU Prime Minister, was in office, a mad cow scare began and resulted in a ban of exports on beef products coming out of the UK that wasn't lifted until 1999, that came paired with some tougher regulations on the exporting of beef. Beef wasn't the only major export battle either, and it just so happened it was another food product that the British wanted to bring to the market. This was chocolate. In 2000, after a 27-year-long legal battle on the naming, the UK was finally able to bring this to market under the title of chocolate instead of being called chocolate substitute, Vegelate, or household milk chocolate, because the UK used vegetable oil instead of cocoa butter in their production. In 2007, after plans for an official EU constitution collapsed, the member nations finished negotiating the controversial Lisbon Treaty, which basically gave Brussels a new set of broader powers. Such of the prominent changes included switching voting from being decided in unanimity to qualified majority voting in at least the 45 policy areas in the Council of Ministers. There was also a change in calculating such a majority to a new double majority. If you don't know what a double majority is, let me briefly explain. The qualified majority would have required that 55% of voting EU member states were present, as well that they were representing at least 65% of the population of the voting members from the European Commission proposal. This would, with a double majority, increase to being 72% of voting member states that represent at least 65% of the EU population. So, as you can tell, that's going to make it so that there's more representation from the smaller countries within it. Next, they consolidated legal personnel for the EU, as well as they created the long-term president of the European Council and a high representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. The treaty also made the Union's Bill of Rights, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, legally binding. Finally, and important to today's conversation, the treaty for the first time gave the member states the explicit legal right to leave the EU and established a procedure by which to do so, also known as Article 50. With the interests of protecting Britain's financial sector, David Cameron became the first UK Prime Minister to veto a EU treaty in 2011. In 2013, Cameron gave a speech in which he outlined the challenges facing Europe and that if a Conservative Party won a majority in the next general election, that the country would renegotiate membership in the EU. While David Cameron was leading the Conservative Party into a new EU renegotiation, they were also needing to fend off the UK Independence Party, which was starting to convert some of their membership due to a harder line position against the EU and a full withdrawal from the political union. These political actions and factors, when coupled together with economic unrest and a migrant refugee crisis, led to an increase in support for Brexit. After winning re-election in May of 2015, Cameron went to work renegotiating the UK-EU relationship, including changes in migrant welfare payments, financial safeguards, and easier ways for Britain to block EU regulations. In February 2016, he announced the results of these negotiations, and that he announced that we would be in June 23rd, they would be promising a referendum to be able to further secure seats for his party from swinging to UKIP by fully leaving the EU. Turnout for the referendum was 71.8%, with more than 30 million people voting. The referendum passed by a very slim margin of 51.9% to 48.1%, but there was also very stark differences across the UK. Skip ahead now to 2019, where after many historic failed votes on Theresa May's plan to leave the EU, 8 final proposals were put up for a vote in late March, just before the deadline was supposed to strike. But all ended up being voted down. For a brief moment, let's go over each of those proposed options by listing them from worst to first, before concluding with the factors at play and what I'd like to see occur. So, number 8, no deal Brexit, just leaving without a plan. Number 7, it's the no deal emergency break, which is basically any member country could notify the EU authorities that it has experienced an inflow of workers of exceptional magnitude over an extended period of time, and that the size of the inflow affects essential aspects of its social security system, or that it leads to serious difficulties in employment market, or is putting excessive pressure on public services. If they did, exclusion from such benefits would be phased out over time. It would be absolute to start with, but benefits would gradually increase. These restrictions wouldn't apply to immigrants that are already working within the UK. Next, you have number 6, a customs union, which is to leave but then to form a customs union so that goods can still freely go between places. Number 5, the Malthouse Plan B, which is basically you ask the European Union to replace the contentious backstop with a technology-based solution to the Irish border. And if that doesn't work, the plan B would be to go for a managed no-deal Brexit, in which the UK would offer the EU money if the bloc agreed to an implementation period. Number 4, a second referendum. Let's put this thing up for a vote again and decide if we're staying or leaving. Number 3, a Labour Brexit, which is basically backing the withdrawal agreement that Theresa May had negotiated, but in return for her seeking a customs union with the EU, as well as a closer alignment to the single market. Number 2, the Norway Plan. It's basically the Norway Plus plan, but without the customs union. And finally, number 1, the Norway Plus plan. It's basically the UK joins the European Free Trade Association, or the EFTA, but that it would negotiate a derogation so that the UK does not have to participate in the EFTA's free trade agreements, and that it can maintain a comprehensive customs arrangement with the EU when the UK joins a comprehensive agreement of customs, which will maintain a common external tariff and make it possible to have frictionless trade and no hard border in Ireland. By December of 2020, excuse that alarm for the moment, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and joins the EFTA Court. By December of 2020, the UK leaves the Common Agricultural Policy as well as the Common Fisheries Policy. But then after December of 2020, the UK will remain in the single market and can take part in decision shaping for new single market regulations and directives. Furthermore, after December of 2020, the UK will remain subject to the freedom of movement, but has a new reserve power which might be used to impose temporary limits on immigration if serious economic, societal, or environmental difficulties arise. So, now, let's go into some of the factors that are helping us determine these solutions and which are more beneficial. So the first is the ability to determine our own trade deals. And by our, I do mean the people of the UK, not technically mine. Next, it is the ability to resolve the North Ireland border. Currently, by leaving with Brexit, there can be some complications to what was known as the 2005 Good Friday Agreement, which once helped dissolve the border in Ireland from Northern Ireland being separated from the Republic of Ireland. To be able to address this, you're going to be needing at least either a customs union or access to the single market. The next factor is EU contributions. As of the last year that the UK was in the EU, which it still is, as of 2018, they were giving an annual contributions of around £8.9 billion a year. The next factor to consider is EU austerity rules, which come into effect if a country exceeds a mandatory debt to GDP ratio of 3%. I believe that the tactical interim solution is that we extend Article 50, that has been done until October, and potentially needs to be extended even further, so that we can hold a new general election for Parliament. Once we have a new Parliament in place, we need to create a solution that preserves the single market, which preserves freedom of movement, and prevents a hard Irish border. But it also has to ensure that the UK can self-determine debt and trade policies while following customs and EU labor laws. In general, multilateral political unions should be encouraged, as long as they preserve strengthening labor laws, ensure fair payment of services rendered by foreign nationals, and has a shared agreement on basic civil rights standards. Like the UK, here in America, we too have our own freedom of movement debate, with the debate over whether we should strengthen, preserve, or eliminate our borders as a nation. Just this week, presidential candidate Bernie Sanders found himself in controversy with some members of the Democratic Party for saying that he is against open borders. I partially agree with the senator. I too would not want open borders unless they were part of a multilateral agreement that would expand our own freedom of movement. For this week's piece of celebrating work on the social left, I wanted to go over a piece written by the economy team where they analyze the pros and cons of having borders. To begin, the discussion the economy team starts off by defining what borders are and the types of impacts that they can play on an economy. Those impacts that they include are immigration, tourism, trade, and international finance. Next, the article goes into an example of how borders are a trade-off, and that by opening them, we do increase the amount of goods that are available, the amount of talent supply that's needed for corporations' job demands, and that we increase the amount of financial tools that a country can possess. But in exchange, you may increase some damage to the environment through increased product transportation and individual transportation. You'll be having more immigrants coming in, which may increase the amount of funding government programs required to function. And there could be decreases in wages in low-skilled jobs. And finally, we'll have an increase in global financial risk due to more people being involved with more financial tools. When weighing these trade-offs, we must remember what we want to focus and preserve, because there will always be benefits and downsides to each side of the open borders debate. I think this is the right conclusion because neither closed borders nor unilaterally open borders are correct, and figuring out a solution requires setting what the correct objectives of the deal are. As I mentioned before, and I know many of you will agree, is that a multilateral political union with free movement zones should be encouraged as long as they preserve and strengthen labor laws, that they ensure fair payment of services rendered by foreign nationals, and that they implement a shared agreement on basic civil rights standards. So what do you guys think? Do you think we should have open borders? Let me know what you think in the comments section down below, or by tweeting at us on Twitter, @TheHillOfRoses. If you like what you watched or listened to today, make sure you subscribe and that you leave us a rating if you're listening or a like here on YouTube. It's the only way we can show that the roses are growing on our hill. Finally, as a reminder, make sure you check out all the fun that we have over on Twitter with Pod Madness, Terrific Tuesday, and the new poll that will be coming out when this episode drops. So, that'll do it, friends. Until next time, stay rosy.